All right, let's talk about something that always gave me chills. Not because it's supernatural, but because it's systematic. In a galaxy where demons can tear reality apart, where Xenos can devour planets whole, and where machine gods whisper in binary prayers, there's still nothing quite as terrifying as faith. Not faith born from revelation or suffering, but faith manufactured on an assembly line. And the architects behind this mass-produced devotion, the Ecclesiarchy. Now don't get me wrong, in a place like the Imperium, belief is more than just hope. It's oxygen. People cling to the Emperor's name the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. But here's the thing. What if that driftwood wasn't floating freely in the sea, but dropped in front of you on purpose? What if your every prayer, every ritual, every vision of divine justice was part of a plan? Not divine, but political. Not mystical, but engineered. See, we're not talking about a grassroots religion here. We're talking about an institution so massive, so entrenched in the arteries of the Imperium, that it makes the administratum look nimble. The Ecclesiarchy doesn't just guide belief, it builds it, like a factory, like a forge, like a damn bolter production line. But instead of weapons, it churns out saints, miracles, rituals, and entire populations who'd rather burn alive than question what they've been told. And this isn't me being cynical. This is the reality we all see in the lore, in the side stories, in the little throwaway lines you catch if you're really paying attention. Faith isn't a spontaneous flame in the 41st millennium. It's fuel-injected, hyper-oxygenated, and mass-deployed with the efficiency of a planetary invasion. So today, let's pull back the curtain. Let's dig into how the Ecclesiarchy makes faith, brick by brick, martyr by martyr, sermon by sermon. Let's ask what it means when belief is no longer personal, but produced. And let's face the uncomfortable possibility that, in the Imperium of man, the greatest lie ever told might also be the only thing holding the species together. Because if the Ecclesiarchy really is a factory, then what does that make the faithful? What does that make us? It's easy to assume that the cult of the God Emperor was born out of the Emperor's greatness, that people saw his light and fell to their knees out of pure awe. That's the romanticized version you'll hear in sermons, in imperial propaganda, and in every single sanctioned history text. But the truth? It's a lot messier. It wasn't some spiritual wildfire that swept through humanity on its own. It was curated, choreographed, a political weapon designed to fill a vacuum of purpose after the Horus heresy shattered the dream of unity. Before the rise of the Ecclesiarchy, the Emperor explicitly rejected godhood. That part is undeniable. His vision was rational, secular, even atheistic in nature. He didn't want humanity worshipping anything, let alone him. He wanted progress through science, enlightenment, and discipline. But after his internment on the Golden Throne, that vision died with him, or more accurately, was buried under centuries of fear and chaos. The galaxy was coming apart at the seams, and something had to hold it together. So, ironically, what the Emperor feared most became the glue of his empire. That's where figures like Eret Stern come in. You won't hear his name much outside certain circles, but this man was one of the first visionaries who understood that faith wasn't just a consequence of desperation. It could be an instrument of control. He didn't just believe in the Emperor's divinity. He saw the utility in spreading that belief. Stern wasn't some wild-eyed mystic. He was a statesman, a manipulator of narratives, a prototype for what the Ecclesiarchy would become. His writings, most of which are now hidden or buried under revisions, were the blueprint for turning loss into doctrine and mourning into mission. And then came the early ecclesiarchs. Saints in name, but politicians in function. They knew exactly what they were doing. They cherry-picked fragments of imperial truth, wrapped them in spiritual symbolism, and created a mythology that was palatable, memorable, and, most importantly, useful. The image of the Emperor as a burning god on the throne was a deliberate choice. It tied into ancient archetypes of divine kingship, martyrdom, and wrathful justice. People needed hope, yes, but more than that, they needed certainty. And what could be more certain than a God who never dies? There's this fan theory I love, that the early dogma wasn't even written by theologians, but by crisis managers. Like, imagine this council of shell-shocked high lords sitting around a table after the heresy, knowing that the galaxy was on the brink of splintering, and one of them says, "What if we give them a god?" Not because they believed it themselves, but because they knew the alternative was anarchy. That's the haunting part. The Emperor's worship may have started not with revelation, but with damage control. And over time, the myth became reality. People were born into it. They lived and died with it. Entire generations forgot that the Emperor ever walked among mortals, or that he once denied being divine. That's the terrifying efficiency of institutionalized belief. It doesn't need to be true, just consistent, just loud, just reinforced by enough cathedrals, martyrdoms, and burning heretics to drown out the memory of anything else. What gets me is how smoothly it all happened. You'd think there'd be more resistance, more documented schisms. But the early Ecclesiarchy was smart. They co-opted dissenters, rewrote contradictory records, and when necessary, just purged the inconvenient parts. It wasn't a debate. It was a cleanup operation. So no, the cult of the God Emperor didn't rise naturally like a sun over Terra. It was forged in the shadows of betrayal and war, then refined through decades, centuries of calculated storytelling. And while it might have saved the Imperium from collapse, it came at the cost of truth, which leads us to the uncomfortable question. If your faith is manufactured, but it still gives you purpose, does that make it any less real? You don't need to read a single sermon to start believing in the Emperor. You just need to walk outside. That's one of the most sinister truths about the Imperium. Faith isn't just preached, it's built. It surrounds you, towers above you, casts shadows over your every step. Every structure, every spire, every crumbling wall and golden arch bleeds the message of devotion. It's not just architecture, it's indoctrination in stone and steel. Let's take the Cathedral of Illumination on Ophelia 7 as an example. It's not just the largest religious structure in the Segmentum Tempestus. It's a planetary landmark visible from orbit. Its towers reach so absurdly high that some of them pierce the edge of the stratosphere. Pilgrims spend entire lives just climbing the front staircases. But here's the thing, it's not really built for function. It's built for feeling. You're meant to feel small, unworthy, and overwhelmed. The grandeur isn't just awe-inspiring, it's weaponized humility. And that's the pattern everywhere. Cities aren't designed around logistics or sustainability. They're designed around monuments, around sacred plazas, martyr shrines, reliquary vaults. You could be walking to a factory shift, and on the way past 3 golden statues of saints, a mosaic of the Emperor's Ascension, and a 10-story pict collage of heretics burning in hellfire. There's no escape from it. The architecture doesn't ask for your belief, it imposes it. Even the layout of cities feeds the narrative. On some shrine worlds, the entire street network forms religious symbols when viewed from above. Think about that. Entire cities designed not for people, but for the Emperor's gaze. Every main road a litany, every marketplace a prayer, every sewer line planned so it doesn't defile some sacred geometric pattern from a millennia-old decree. There's a fan theory I absolutely love that claims some of these cities were deliberately designed to induce religious hallucinations. Like, the angles of certain cathedral windows are supposed to distort natural light into patterns that resemble holy symbols, tricking the brain into thinking it's having a vision. Others think incense distribution is chemically enhanced to affect mood and obedience. And who's going to question it when you suddenly feel reverent while standing under a golden dome the size of a hive block? It's not just grand buildings either. The so-called monolith lanterns, those towering, silent structures you'll find scattered through major imperial cities, aren't just there to light the streets. They play low-frequency hymns you can't consciously hear, but that still reach your subconscious. Some of them have skull-shaped speakers hidden in their structure, whispering liturgies at night. You ever hear an entire street softly chant, "The Emperor protects," while you're trying to sleep? You don't forget it. What gets me most is how the very scale of it creates a sense of inevitability. You see a wall of gold and stone so massive you can't see the top, and somewhere deep down, something in your brain says, "This must be true." Not because it makes sense, not because it's just, but because no one builds something like that unless they believe, or want you to believe. It's a loop. The structure proves the faith, and the faith justifies the structure. I've read accounts from hive-worlders who'd never even heard of Xenos or demons, but who still knew every line of the Lectitio Divinitatis by heart, just from reading the inscribed walls around their hab blocks. They weren't taught, they absorbed it. And that's the genius of ecclesiarchal architecture. It doesn't wait for you to think. It gets under your skin before you even realize you're listening. Even ruins serve a purpose. A shattered chapel is still a chapel. A broken statue still points upward. The message doesn't die when the stone crumbles. It becomes a warning, a reminder of heresy punished, of faith tested, of glory deferred. There's no neutral space in the Imperium. Not physically, not spiritually. Everything is built to tell a story, and you're already in it, whether you consented or not. You know what always caught my attention? How every imperial priest seems to have that same unshakable fire in their voice, that same glint in their eyes that says they've seen something, even if they haven't. They all talk like prophets, move like stage performers, and die like martyrs, on cue. And the more you start digging into it, the more it becomes clear. These people aren't just believers. They're trained, sculpted, sometimes even manufactured from the ground up to embody belief in a way that's almost theatrical. It's no secret that the Schola Progenium breeds commissars and stormtroopers. But what a lot of people forget is that it also produces preachers. And not just the firebrand, shout until you bleed kind either, though those are definitely useful. The Schola molds every kind of priest imaginable. The gentle, soft-spoken confessor, the zealous war chaplain, the silver-tongued cardinal who can negotiate with rogue governors or stir crowds into riots. They're cast into roles like actors and trained to perform faith in whatever flavor is most effective for their mission. And it really is a mission. Priests don't just randomly appear on some forgotten mining world and start preaching. They're deployed, strategically. You've got uprising in a frontier system? Send in a redemptionist preacher to start lighting fires, both metaphorical and literal. Got an agri-world full of sluggish workers? Drop in a serene Missionaria Galaxia sister to preach about the Emperor's love for toil and sacrifice. It's targeted messaging, wrapped in divine trappings. One fan theory I love says that the Ecclesiarchy actually keeps a catalog of faith archetypes, templates for every kind of demographic. So when they send someone to a world, it's not just about religious guidance, it's about psychological compatibility. You don't send a flaming sermonizer to a culture that values restraint. You send someone who can play the part of their ideal prophet, someone they'll want to believe in. It's like casting a lead in a play that's already been running for generations. And that's not even the most unsettling part. Some of them might not even be fully human anymore. There are rumors, only whispers really, of synthetic clergy. Not servitors exactly, but biologically engineered zealots, grown or reconstructed for the sole purpose of preaching. Souls that have been wiped, rewritten, or downloaded from archives of perfect sermons. The church doesn't admit this, obviously, but in a galaxy where cloning and memory implants exist, where minds can be reforged in black ships, and assassins get personality rewrites. Is it really that far-fetched? But even if you put the sci-fi horror aside, the reality is still chilling. These priests rehearse their deaths, literally. There's documented evidence of them practicing martyrdom speeches, the proper angle to fall from a pyre, even how to scream in a way that leaves the right impression. Their final moments aren't always spontaneous. They're scripted for maximum impact. Because nothing spreads faith faster than a glorious public death in the name of the Emperor. And they know it. There's an account I read once, apocryphal maybe, but it stuck with me, about a young preacher who failed his final test because his delivery lacked divine cadence. He believed everything he said, but he didn't sound like he did. And that was enough to deem him unfit. Can you imagine that? Sincerity wasn't the issue. Performance was. Because in the Ecclesiarchy, truth is secondary to presentation. That's the part that messes with your head. You grow up thinking these men and women are spiritual giants, touched by the emperor himself, and maybe some of them are. But for many, it's just another uniform, another mask. They look like saints. They speak like saints. But behind that fire and fervor might be someone who spent 20 years perfecting their monologue, not their soul. And yet, it works. People cry when they speak. They fall to their knees. They kill for these voices. Because even if the passion is rehearsed, the effect is real. It moves people. It builds armies. It reshapes entire worlds. Maybe that's the point. Maybe belief doesn't have to be born in a heart to take root in someone else's. Maybe faith can be passed along like a flame, even if the torchbearer is wearing gloves. That's what makes it so dangerous and so brilliant. The Ecclesiarchy doesn't just teach belief, it performs it. And when the lights go up, when the incense rises and the sermon begins, you can't help but believe, even if part of you knows it's all been rehearsed. There's a phrase you hear a lot in the Imperium. The Emperor is all around us. And yeah, on the surface, it sounds poetic, comforting even. But when you grow up inside it, when you live it every single moment of your life, you realize it's not a metaphor. It's a design, a system, a prison made of liturgies, statues, and auto-prayers that never stop whispering. From the moment you're born, literally, your first breath, you're under the shadow of the church. Midwives recite holy verses during delivery. The first voice most infants hear isn't their mother's. It's a servo-hymnal praising the emperor for a safe birthing. That's the tone setter. Before you even learn to walk, you've already heard hundreds of prayers. And then come the lullabies. But these aren't soft songs about love or dreams. They're rewritten psalms about duty and sacrifice, stories of saints who walked into fire with smiles on their faces, tales of children who tattled on their heretic parents and were blessed with holy martyrdom. Imagine being tucked into bed every night with the image of burning heretics in your head. That's not bedtime. It's indoctrination through routine comfort. By the time you're old enough to eat solids, your food is stamped with purity seals, actual little wax emblems or printed prayers on your ration packs. Some people even say there are liturgical codes baked into the nutrient paste itself. A kind of edible prayer: chew, swallow, obey. Every meal a ritual, every hunger a moment to reflect on divine mercy. And don't even think about eating without first reciting the meal hymn. That alone can get you reported in some hive districts. School? That's not education, that's reinforcement. You learn catechisms before you learn to count. History lessons are stories of heresies crushed and miracles performed. Science is repackaged as techno-litany, where natural law is spoken of only in terms of divine will. Gravity isn't gravity. It's the Emperor's will holding you to the soil. Stars don't shine because of fusion. They shine because his gaze never leaves the galaxy. Everything has a theological layer. There's no neutral knowledge, and it never stops. Even in adulthood, when you're toiling away in a manufactorum or serving in a PDF unit, the indoctrination continues. Loudspeakers blare sermons on repeat, not just once a day, constantly. They cycle through a series of praises, condemnations, cautionary tales, and chants. There are entire Vox networks dedicated to this. Some hab blocks are hardwired to transmit only ecclesiarchal frequencies. No escape, not unless you want to be labeled suspicious. You ever heard of a blessing droid? They're these servo skulls or mech cherubs that float around public squares, spouting random verses or spraying incense in your face while you wait in line for corpse starch. Some of them even have facial recognition servitors attached, watching your reactions, logging whether you kneel or not. There's this awful story out of Necromunda about a guy who got dragged into a redemption cell because he didn't cross hymself fast enough when a hymn played. His neighbor reported him, not out of malice, out of fear that if he didn't report it, he would be next. Kids play with toys shaped like saints. There are coloring books that depict the execution of the 9 apostates of Gethal's Reach. I've seen them. Bright, cheerful illustrations of men being burned alive, and the caption reads, "They doubted the light." There's no line between faith and life. It's all one constant, suffocating continuum. Even dreams aren't safe. There's a rumor that some hive worlds lace the air with low-grade chem-sleep mists infused with psionic suggestions. People report dreaming of angels, of golden thrones, of judgment, and the dreams are always the same. If that's true, if dreams are part of the program, it means there's literally no part of you that's private, not even your subconscious. But here's the messed up part. After enough time, it doesn't feel like control. It feels like home. The constant rituals, the ever-present sermons, the statues watching from every corner, they become background noise, comforting even. Like white noise in the back of your mind, lulling you into obedience. Not because you're forced anymore, but because you can't imagine life without it. I've heard arguments from people, imperial citizens who escaped or renegade scribes, that say the emperor doesn't even need miracles. He just needs the appearance of omnipresence. That the true power of the Ecclesiarchy isn't that it teaches belief, but that it makes disbelief literally impossible. And when you live in that kind of world, when every waking and sleeping moment is shaped by the same unrelenting narrative, you don't need a preacher to convert you. You're already converted, before you even knew there was a choice. There's something eerie about how common miracles are in the Imperium. I mean, you'd think that divine intervention would be rare, awe-inspiring, once-in-a-generation kind of stuff. But in the worlds of the Ecclesiarchy, it's practically routine. A statue crying tears of promethium here, a blind child suddenly seeing again there, a burning heretic whose screams echo the Emperor's name. It's constant. And when something sacred becomes that frequent, you start asking uncomfortable questions, like whether the sacred was ever there to begin with. It's hard to talk about this without sounding like a heretic, but there are entire sectors where the miracles feel staged, too clean, too perfect. I've seen the footage from Venerax Prime, where a preacher cured a crowd of cripples in one sweeping gesture. Dozens leaping out of wheelchairs, tears streaming, praising the Emperor. But if you watch closely, frame by frame, you notice something weird. All the healed are from the same manufactorum, same uniforms, same missing limbs in the exact same place. And afterward, no records of them anywhere. Not in the rolls, not in the population count. Just gone, like props after a scene. And that's what these miracles start to feel like. Scenes. Scripted moments of transcendence, carefully executed to reinforce belief. A fire that burns in the shape of the Aquila. A saint's relic glowing during a solar eclipse. A lightning strike that hits only the heretic in a crowd. I'm not saying the Emperor can't perform miracles. Maybe he does. But what I am saying is that the Ecclesiarchy has gotten very, very good at making it look like he did. They even have sanctioned miracle stagers, people whose job it is to orchestrate the divine. They're not called that, obviously. They go by names like wards of verification or liturgical compliance officials. But everyone knows what they do. They scout locations, set the stage, ensure the right people are in the right place at the right time. And then, bam, miracle. One moment, you're a backwater agri-colony on the edge of rebellion. The next, you're the site of a holy vision with pilgrims flooding in and faith suddenly surging. It's not divine wrath, it's crisis management. There's a particularly notorious event that fans still argue about, the burning choir of Talaxis. The story goes that during a feast day, a group of orphans began singing the Emperor's hymn in perfect harmony, even though none of them had ever spoken before. And as they sang, their bodies caught fire, but they didn't stop. They kept singing until only ashes remained. The crowd was stunned. Pilgrimages began. A cathedral was built. But years later, a data slate surfaced suggesting that the orphans were actually servitors, programmed for that one moment. Their flesh was laced with flammable oils, their voices mechanized. The file disappeared fast, too fast, which made people wonder, was it ever real? Or was the real miracle how well the Ecclesiarchy pulled it off? And honestly, why wouldn't they do it? In a galaxy as brutal as the Imperium, belief isn't just a comfort. It's a tool of survival. If a carefully timed miracle keeps an entire hive from turning to chaos, maybe it's worth the lie. Maybe the truth is less important than the effect. After all, who's going to check? The Arbites, the Inquisition? They're probably in on it. Or at the very least, they understand that illusion can serve righteousness just as effectively as revelation. Some even argue that the Emperor himself wants these illusions, that he allows them, even encourages them, because he knows the human species needs them, that 1,000,000 fake miracles are better than one lost soul, that the real heresy is letting people feel abandoned. I don't know if I buy that, but it's a comforting thought. Dangerous, but comforting. And it doesn't stop at dramatic events. There are also the subtle signs, the smell of sanctified incense appearing without warning, walls weeping holy oil, Vox units randomly broadcasting the Emperor's voice in languages no one remembers teaching them. These things don't get big headlines, but they spread fast through word of mouth. A local priest confirms them, the Ecclesiarchy sends a team, and suddenly a shrine pops up, a festival is declared, and the area is reclassified as spiritually vital. It's also convenient. What haunts me isn't the idea that the miracles are fake. It's the idea that they work anyway, that people change because of them, that hearts are moved, that destinies shift, that entire lives are given to the Emperor in gratitude for something that might have been orchestrated behind the curtain. Because if the outcome is the same, does it matter if the cause was divine or artificial? And maybe that's the most twisted brilliance of all. The Ecclesiarchy doesn't need the Emperor to reach down and touch the faithful. They just need to convince you he might. That's enough. That keeps the gears turning. That keeps the tithe flowing. That keeps 1,000,000,000 souls whispering prayers into the void, hoping for a miracle that may never come, but believing because last week someone saw a statue bleed. There's something uniquely disturbing about hearing a machine preach. Not a person using a Vox amp, not a recorded sermon played back through a picked unit. I mean an actual machine, a lobotomized half-metal creature whose only remaining function is to shout the Emperor's name on repeat. No hesitation, no stutter, no self-awareness, just pure, unwavering devotion, played like a hymn looped for eternity. That's where faith in the Imperium goes beyond the flesh. It's not just believed, it's installed. I still remember the first time I saw a preacher servitor up close. It wasn't just the smell, burnt oils and old blood, it was the sound. A slow, rhythmic drone, repeating a litany I'd heard 100 times before, but somehow it felt colder coming from that broken mouth. Its jaw moved in stiff, pre-programmed intervals, lips twitching like dying muscle. No inflection, no passion, just the voice of belief stripped of humanity. And that's the point, isn't it? These machines don't falter, they don't sleep, they don't question. They broadcast faith in its purest, most mechanical form. These things are everywhere. You'll find them nailed to the sides of war cathedrals, shuffling through pilgrim crowds, stationed in the corners of manufactorums. Some are mobile, others are bolted into place like furniture. Their bodies vary, some skeletal, some bloated with data tanks, but their message is always the same. Worship, repent, obey. Sometimes they even bleed, but it's always oil mixed with incense. Whether that's a symbolic design choice or just poorly maintained tubing, well, maybe both. Then there's the liturgical automatons, the so-called liturgy. These are next level, not just drones that scream sermons, but mobile sanctifiers equipped with incense jets, vox casters, and sometimes even weapons. They're built to accompany pilgrimages, purify streets before processions, or storm into heretic zones blasting sacred scripture as they cleanse. One model even had a built-in flamer and would exorcise corrupted zones with fire and prayer simultaneously. Imagine being a heretic and hearing your last moments echoed in machine-chanted psalms as flame eats your world. Horrifying, but efficient, and we haven't even touched on the relictors. These are less mobile and more monolithic, towering constructs that are basically walking churches. Giant vox towers wrapped in stained glass, flanked by chains of servo skulls, broadcasting sermons across entire cities. They don't move often, but when they do, it's a spectacle. Streets clear, crowds bow. The sheer pressure of sound can make you feel physically pushed to your knees. Some people call it the Emperor's voice made manifest. Others just call it deafening. There's a fan theory that relictors were inspired by ancient Mars war horns, that the tech priests reconfigured those designs into sound-based indoctrination platforms. The idea being that volume and repetition could beat resistance out of the human brain. Whether or not that's true, it certainly feels like you're being conquered every time one rolls by. What fascinates me is how normalized it's all become. People don't look twice at a servo preacher anymore. Kids grow up hearing the clanking of mechanical feet and the static crackle of machine prayers, and they just accept it. That's what belief looks like to them. Not a parent kneeling quietly at a shrine, but a rusted abomination reciting the canticle of St. Drusus in 6 tones at once. It's not even unsettling anymore. It's comforting. That's how deep the indoctrination goes. The machine feels more reliable than a man. And let's be honest, maybe it is. A human preacher can fail. They can sin, hesitate, forget a line, lose faith. A machine can't. A machine will scream the same verse for 1,000 years without blinking. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't get bored. It doesn't fear. That kind of constancy becomes sacred in a galaxy where everything else is chaos. It's terrifying, but it's also kind of brilliant. There are even cases of tech priests customizing servitors to match local dialects, cultural references, even planetary customs. Imagine that. Faith tailored through machine learning, an adaptive, multilingual gospel engine capable of calibrating its sermons to break through resistance. It's not just preaching, it's algorithmic conversion. In another life, this would be marketing. In the Imperium, it's salvation through circuit boards. And you start to wonder if these machines are preaching more consistently, more accurately, and to larger crowds than human priests ever could. Are they the real clergy now? Have we reached a point where the organic believer is obsolete, where the future of faith isn't in the heart, but in the data stream? I don't know. Maybe the Emperor smiles on the servitor that chants his name from a broken throat, or maybe he weeps. Either way, the sermon keeps playing. The vox never stops. The gears never rest. In the Imperium, even belief has been mechanized, and it never ever powers down. There's a moment during the March of St. Ephrael where you can actually feel the ground shake, not from tanks or aircraft, but from the feet of hundreds of thousands of pilgrims walking in perfect step, chanting the same verse over and over until it carves itself into your skull. I saw it once on Tarsus Ultra, and I swear it wasn't just a parade. It felt like the entire planet was holding its breath, waiting for something holy and violent to happen. And that's the thing with the Imperium's rituals. They're not just performances. They're psychological weapons, sharpened through millennia of tradition and trauma. These mass displays of devotion aren't optional, they're required. Entire populations are expected to participate in feast days, mourning processions, blood rites, fire dances, and, in the most fanatical sectors, literal human sacrifice. Everyone knows the calendar. You don't forget the Day of Burning Ashes or the Night of Crimson Screams, not unless you want to disappear quietly into an ecclesiarchal oubliette. But beyond compliance, there's something deeper going on. These events don't just enforce unity, they program it. Take the Feast of the Martyr's Flame. On that day, Thousands willingly set themselves on fire in public squares, chanting praises to the emperor until their voices melt into screams. It's horrifying, it's unforgettable, and it's broadcast live across entire systems. Children watch, veterans weep, whole sectors light candles and vow to live more righteously. It's a grotesque kind of inspiration, one that forces you to measure your own faith by the screams of someone else's devotion. Then there are the pilgrimage routes, long punishing journeys across irradiated wastes, through war zones, across oceans of toxic sludge. Entire hives uproot just to walk them, not because it's safe or efficient, but because suffering is sanctified. The harder the road, the more you must believe. And by the end, if you survive, the trauma has done its work. You're not the same. You're open, pliable, ready to accept whatever the church gives you next. And when all else fails, there's war. The Ecclesiarchy doesn't just bless wars, they start them. They frame them as purges, as crusades, as holy cleansings of the impure. But when you look past the rhetoric, it becomes clear that these wars serve a very specific psychological function. They give the faithful an outlet, a purpose, a chance to prove their belief with blood. It's easier to march into battle when you've spent your life watching self-immolations and listening to sermons about the glory of sacrifice. One story always stuck with me. On Ferventia Secundus, there was a heretical sect that simply refused to kneel during morning rites. They didn't rebel. They didn't spread chaos. They just stood, silent, defiant. The Ecclesiarchy responded by declaring a planetary crusade, not because the sect was powerful, but because their resistance was symbolic. The church needed to make an example, and they did. The final battle was less a military engagement and more a public execution on a planetary scale. Billions died, and afterward the survivors built a cathedral over the ashes. That's the message. Faith isn't just a belief. It's an act of constant performative submission. Even the architecture of ritual plays a part. Altars are deliberately oversized. Ropes for flagellation are left out in the open, visible reminders of what devotion looks like. Vox hymns increase in pitch and frequency during holy seasons to create a sense of mounting spiritual pressure. There's no escaping the rhythm of the liturgical year. It's a clock that doesn't mark time. It marks obedience. What's terrifying is how effective it all is. People anticipate these events with the same reverence others reserve for birth or death. They mark time by sacrifice. They measure faith by blood spilled, voices lost, limbs given in battle or ritual. The repetition doesn't just create loyalty, it erases individuality. When you've marched the same path 100 times, screamed the same verses 1,000 times, watched a million die in the emperor's name, you stop questioning. You start participating. There's even a theory, dark but popular among rogue scholars, that holy wars aren't just responses to heresy. They're engineered at regular intervals, like controlled burns. The Imperium needs them to reset the spiritual equilibrium. Too much peace breeds stagnation. Too much comfort breeds doubt. So every generation or two, a new crusade begins, not to win territory, but to renew devotion. And maybe that's why the Ecclesiarchy put so much effort into spectacle. Because in a universe so vast and cruel, belief doesn't survive on logic. It survives on emotion, on awe, on terror, on pageantry so overwhelming it drowns out fear and replaces it with fervor. It's not enough to believe. You have to bleed that belief into the ground so others will see it and remember. So when you watch a column of faithful dragging a golden effigy through a burning wasteland, know that it's not just ceremony. It's a ritual of control, a psychological hammer, and it hits the same spot in every mind, again and again, until it leaves a dent deep enough to live in. There's this lie we tell ourselves, that people believe in the Emperor because of hope, because of some radiant, inspiring love for humanity's savior. But that's not how faith works in the Imperium. Not really. You don't kneel out of love. You kneel because you're afraid to stand. Because the moment you look up and say, "I'm not sure," the walls start closing in. Faith in the Imperium is forged in fear. It always has been. I've seen it with my own eyes, on hive worlds where ash falls like rain, where the air tastes of rust and old prayers, where sermons echo across walls stained with the blood of those who hesitated. No one whispers doubts in the Imperium, not unless they have a death wish. Because the truth is, it's not the Ecclesiarchy that gets you most of the time. It's your neighbor, your child, your friend. They've all been taught that reporting heresy is piety, that the more you sacrifice, relationships, empathy, trust, the holier you become. There's a saying in some hive clusters, "He who confesses first gets the lighter flame." Imagine that being the wisdom you grow up with. Not be honest or do good, but burn faster. That's how deep fear goes here. It's not just a consequence of belief. It's the foundation. You don't stay loyal because you're inspired. You stay loyal because you know what happens if you don't. And what happens is never subtle. When the Ecclesiarchy wants to make an example, they make it spectacular. They don't just execute heretics, they perform it. The flensing knives, the pyres, the slow suffocation chambers, they're all part of the doctrine. Pain isn't just punishment, it's pedagogy. It teaches the masses what awaits anyone who lets doubt seep in. And no one is exempt. The poor suffer first, but the higher you rise, the more brutal the fall becomes. A cardinal who fails to condemn loudly enough can find himself stripped, branded, and paraded through the streets before being fed to fire. Exterminatus is the ultimate expression of that fear. Not just death, not just retribution, but erasure. The declaration that your entire world, your culture, your history, everything about you has been deemed unworthy of salvation. It's not justice, it's theater on a cosmic scale. And the message it sends is deafening. Faith is not optional, faith is mandatory, and its absence is a contagion the Imperium will burn planets to stop. People tell stories of miraculous conversions that happen in dungeons, in confession chambers, on the edge of a torture rack. They're recited like saintly legends, how a suspected heretic saw the light mid-scream and begged for the Emperor's mercy just before being immolated. But you can't help but ask, was that faith? Or was that terror reaching for the only lifeline it had left? And here's the thing. This fear doesn't just create believers. It creates zealots. People so afraid of their own inner doubts that they project their faith violently outward. That's where you get the self-flagellants, the street preachers who scream until their lungs rupture, the redemptionist mobs who burn down half a district because someone looked at a painting the wrong way. These aren't saints. They're trauma victims trying to outscream the silence in their own minds. And the Ecclesiarchy lets it happen, encourages it even. Because loud fear is useful. It spreads. One fan theory I've always found compelling is that fear is not just a byproduct of ecclesiarchal control. It's the actual sacrament. That when people scream his name in terror, the psychic energy of that moment feeds into the warp and reinforces the Emperor's divine presence. Not love, not joy, fear. A constant current of desperation that binds humanity tighter than any litany ever could. If that's true, it makes the whole machine even darker, but also more coherent. Because then, fear isn't a flaw, it's the fuel. I read a report once, buried deep in the archives of a rogue archivist, about a planet where faith began to waver, not rebellion, just weariness. People stopped singing during sermons. They bowed more slowly, they stopped self-reporting, and so the Ecclesiarchy staged a mass cleansing. Thousands executed, entire families purged, the air filled with screams for days. And afterward, the litanies were louder, the bowing deeper, the prayers longer. The planet believed again. That's the cycle. Fear leads to obedience. Obedience reinforces the system. And when the fear starts to fade, the system creates more of it. It's not a glitch. It's the mechanism itself. And the most haunting part? It works. Generation after generation, system after system, world after world. They all bow. They all obey. They all believe. Because they've been taught, from cradle to grave, that the price of disbelief isn't damnation. It's annihilation. Personal, communal, total. So yes, people believe in the Emperor, but they don't believe because they trust him. They believe because they're terrified of what happens if they don't. And if that's not the purest form of control, I don't know what is. There's something especially cruel about how the Imperium deals with memory. It's not enough to punish you for doubting. They have to erase the doubt itself, like it never happened, like you never happened. They don't just want loyalty, they want revised loyalty, a loyalty that never faltered. And in a galaxy run by the Ecclesiarchy and its allies, the past is not a record, it's a weapon, one that can be sharpened, rewritten, deleted. We've all heard the phrase, history is written by the victors, but in the Imperium, history is written by the pious, and it's edited constantly. Holy texts are updated by scribes under inquisitorial seal. Entire events are removed from the archives because a later theologian decided they were ambiguous in dogma. Planets that once rebelled are rebranded as loyal shrines. Saints who didn't exist a century ago now have statues on every hive world. And if you try to argue against the official version, well, then you must be remembering it wrong. Or worse, you've been influenced. But that's just the surface. What really terrifies me is what they do to individual memory. I once read an account, buried in the footnotes of a Mechanicus transmission, about a man who was caught reading a pre-imperial history text. Nothing blasphemous, just old. He didn't even resist when they arrested him. But instead of execution, he was taken to a reconditioning chapel. When he came out, he had no idea who he was. All he remembered were hymns. His name was gone, his family forgotten. But he could quote the Lectitio Divinitatis backwards, and he smiled the whole time. That's what they call a clean reset, and it's done through a mix of neurosurgery, psychic intervention, and sheer psychological bludgeoning. They hook you into memory purge chairs, fill your brain with feedback loops of holy scripture until your own thoughts collapse. If that doesn't work, they send in psychers trained not for offense, but for editing. Mind sculptors, memory flensers. They don't just wipe, they replace. You go in a skeptic and come out quoting fabricated memories of miracles you never saw. There's a whole class of sanctioned psychers called menestrotheurgists. Their job is literally to reformat belief at the individual and societal level. It's not just that they make you forget heresy, they make you remember faith. They install images of golden light where there were once questions. They seed your dreams with visions of saintly approval. Some even claim that menestrotheurgists can fabricate entire lifetimes, convince you that you were born in a monastery, raised by confessors, touched by divine fire at age 7. And who's going to disprove it? You? It's not always that dramatic either. Sometimes it's subtle. A few key memories adjusted here and there. You forget a conversation that made you uncomfortable. A detail about a sermon you didn't agree with suddenly feels correct. You no longer remember your sister doubting the Emperor, just that she was always quiet and kind. And then she disappeared. And maybe that was fair. Maybe that was just... The Ecclesiarchy keeps tight control of all written records. Everything goes through multiple layers of censorship, revision, theological audit. I once held a copy of a planetary history that listed 10 high ecclesiarchs between the age of apostasy and M36. The next time I checked, the exact same tome listed 8. No explanation, no revision stamp, just edited, like reality itself had been tidied up. And it's not just books. Art gets redacted too. Mosaics are altered. Saintly portraits are updated to reflect newly discovered truths. In one chilling case on Seraphis Prime, they actually re-sculpted a cathedral wall so that a once condemned figure now appeared kneeling beside the emperor instead of burning beneath him. Entire generations now walk past that image, absorbing a message that didn't exist 20 years ago. This is why truth in the Imperium feels so slippery. You never really know anything. You only know what's been allowed to survive. And that fragility breeds paranoia. You don't trust your own memory. You wait for the sermon to tell you how to feel about your past. And if the sermon changes next week, well, you change with it. Because clinging to the wrong version of events can cost you your life. Or worse, your mind. Some say this is all for the greater good. That a unified faith, even a constructed one, is better than chaos. That tampering with memory is a mercy compared to letting doubt fester. But I've always felt that something sacred is lost when your beliefs aren't truly yours. When you've been programmed to worship, not inspired to, it becomes a pantomime, a pageant of belief without the soul that made it real. And maybe that's the final tragedy. In the Imperium, even your memories aren't truly yours. They belong to the God Emperor, and he, or more precisely, his church, reserves the right to rewrite them whenever they see fit. You don't just give them your loyalty, you give them your past. And once that's gone, what even are you anymore? For all the Ecclesiarchy's might, for all the sermons, servitors, and blood-soaked rituals, faith in the Imperium isn't invincible. Sometimes it breaks, sometimes it fails. And when it does, the cracks aren't always dramatic. They start small, a whispered doubt, a silence during morning prayer, a citizen who suddenly stops kneeling. And before long, something that looked eternal starts to rot from within. Faith, even manufactured faith, isn't always fireproof. There was a case I read about on Miralis Secunda, a small mining world, nothing particularly special. The people were loyal, quiet, their shrine attendance was high, their tithe met every year. But then something changed. A single off-world trader brought in stories, harmless at first. Stories of distant worlds where the Emperor walked among men, where saints bled golden ichor, where relics could whisper your fate. The locals were fascinated, then confused, then skeptical, because their lives had no saints, no miracles, just stone, toil, and sermons on repeat. Something snapped. People started skipping prayers. Then gatherings stopped. Then came the silent nights. No hymns, no incense, no confessions. The Ecclesiarchy sent a correction team, not a kill squad at first. Just a few well-trained confessors, some sermon servitors, a relic or two. But the spark didn't reignite. It fizzled. No riots, no rebellion, just apathy. And that, more than heresy, terrifies the church. Heretics can be burned. Apostates can be hunted. But the indifferent? They slip through the cracks. They don't resist. They just don't care. What do you do with someone who simply no longer feels anything? The answer apparently is escalate. On Miralis, they leveled the shrine district, declared it impure, rebuilt it in white marble and stained glass at massive expense. They imported choirs, saintly relics, and even staged a miracle, the weeping statue of Saint Aramis. But no one came. The people watched from their homes, eyes blank, no protests, no praise, just stillness. The faith had died, quietly, and no amount of fire could reignite it. Then there are the chaotic collapses, literally. Encounters with the warp that leave believers shattered, screaming, or hollowed out. Entire planets have seen their faith implode in a single day after a demon host strolls through a congregation. There was one infamous event on Duranth's Hope. A preacher claimed to see visions of the Emperor nightly, until a demon, disguised as the Emperor himself, appeared mid-sermon and ripped his congregation limb from limb. Survivors were found gibbering, eyes scorched out, whispering that the Emperor had laughed as they burned. Within a week, the entire planetary faith collapsed, not into heresy, into madness. And that's what chaos does best. Not destroy faith outright, but invert it, pervert it. Make you question if the voice you've been hearing in your dreams is the Emperor, or something else that's just better at pretending. In response, the Ecclesiarchy doesn't always purge right away. Sometimes they try to overwrite the collapse with even more spectacle. Crusades, saintly visits, miraculous healings by sanctioned psychers. But it doesn't always work. In fact, it can make things worse. When faith becomes too mechanical, too scripted, people start noticing the seams. And once you've seen the trick behind the miracle, no amount of incense can cover the lie. Sectarian splintering is another quiet failure. It usually starts with someone sincerely trying to deepen their faith. A new interpretation of a saint's words, a new ritual, something harmless. But then it spreads. People follow. And soon you've got a cult that looks almost correct, but not quite. A mispronounced litany. A candle placed on the wrong side of an altar. The tiniest deviation, but it snowballs. The Ecclesiarchy calls them mutations of devotion, and they treat them with surgical precision, not just to kill the mutation, but to erase the memory of it. On Galantria, a preacher began teaching that true faith didn't require pain, that silent meditation was the emperor's preferred worship. The church let it run for 3 months. Then came the purifiers. They didn't just kill him, they vaporized the chapel, erased the records, mind-scrubbed the followers, and rebuilt the zone as a penitentiary, like it had never happened. It's brutal, but it also proves something the Ecclesiarchy will never admit. They know their system isn't flawless. They know belief can falter. That's why they overcorrect so violently, not out of cruelty but fear. Because if one world forgets how to believe, what's stopping the next? There's a haunting fan theory I've come across, that the Golden Throne itself doesn't just sustain the Emperor, but feeds on collective belief. That the strength of his will, his psychic presence, is tethered not just to sacrifice or devotion, but to the raw subconscious belief of the masses. So every time a world's faith dies, a part of him dims. And maybe that's why the Ecclesiarchy burns so bright when doubt creeps in. Because it's not just doctrine at stake, it's survival. So yes, faith breaks. Sometimes quietly, sometimes with screams, but it does break. And every time it does, the Ecclesiarchy scrambles to patch the rupture, to silence the memory, to pretend it never happened. But for those who saw it, who felt the collapse, it never really leaves them. And maybe, just maybe, they walk away not as heretics, but as survivors of something far more terrifying than doubt. Survivors of a system that couldn't quite hold. For all the Ecclesiarchy's might, for all the sermons, servitors, and blood-soaked rituals, faith in the Imperium isn't invincible. Sometimes it breaks, sometimes it fails. And when it does, the cracks aren't always dramatic. They start small. A whispered doubt. A silence during morning prayer. A citizen who suddenly stops kneeling. And before long, something that looked eternal starts to rot from within. Faith, even manufactured faith, isn't always fireproof. There was a case I read about on Miralis Secunda, a small mining world, nothing particularly special. The people were loyal, quiet. Their shrine attendance was high, their tithe met every year. But then something changed. A single off-world trader brought in stories. Harmless at first. Stories of distant worlds where the Emperor walked among men, where saints bled golden ichor, where relics could whisper your fate. The locals were fascinated, then confused, then skeptical, because their lives had no saints, no miracles, just stone, toil, and sermons on repeat. Something snapped. People started skipping prayers, then gatherings stopped. Then came the silent nights, no hymns, no incense, no confessions. The Ecclesiarchy sent a correction team, not a kill squad at first, just a few well-trained confessors, some sermon servitors, a relic or two. But the spark didn't reignite. It fizzled. No riots, no rebellion, just apathy. And that, more than heresy, terrifies the church. Heretics can be burned, apostates can be hunted, but the indifferent? They slip through the cracks. They don't resist, they just don't care. What do you do with someone who simply no longer feels anything? The answer, apparently, is escalate. On Miralis, they leveled the shrine district, declared it impure, rebuilt it in white marble and stained glass at massive expense. They imported choirs, saintly relics, and even staged a miracle, the weeping statue of Saint Aramis. But no one came. The people watched from their homes, eyes blank, no protests, no praise, just stillness. The faith had died, quietly, and no amount of fire could reignite it. Then there are the chaotic collapses, literally, encounters with the warp that leave believers shattered, screaming, or hollowed out. Entire planets have seen their faith implode in a single day after a demon host strolls through a congregation. There was one infamous event on Duranth's Hope. A preacher claimed to see visions of the Emperor nightly, until a demon, disguised as the Emperor himself, appeared mid-sermon and ripped his congregation limb from limb. Survivors were found gibbering, eyes scorched out, whispering that the Emperor had laughed as they burned. Within a week, the entire planetary faith collapsed, not into heresy, into madness. And that's what chaos does best. Not destroy faith outright, but invert it, pervert it, make you question if the voice you've been hearing in your dreams is the Emperor, or something else that's just better at pretending. In response, the Ecclesiarchy doesn't always purge right away. Sometimes they try to overwrite the collapse with even more spectacle: crusades, saintly visits, miraculous healings by sanctioned psychers. But it doesn't always work. In fact, it can make things worse. When faith becomes too mechanical, too scripted, people start noticing the seams. And once you've seen the trick behind the miracle, no amount of incense can cover the lie. Sectarian splintering is another quiet failure. It usually starts with someone sincerely trying to deepen their faith. A new interpretation of a saint's words, a new ritual, something harmless. But then it spreads. People follow. And soon you've got a cult that looks almost correct, but not quite. A mispronounced litany, a candle placed on the wrong side of an altar, the tiniest deviation, but it snowballs. The Ecclesiarchy calls them mutations of devotion, and they treat them with surgical precision. Not just to kill the mutation, but to erase the memory of it. On Galantria, a preacher began teaching that true faith didn't require pain, that silent meditation was the Emperor's preferred worship. The church let it run for 3 months. Then came the purifiers. They didn't just kill him. They vaporized the chapel, erased the records, mind-scrubbed the followers, and rebuilt the zone as a penitentiary, like it had never happened. It's brutal, but it also proves something the Ecclesiarchy will never admit. They know their system isn't flawless. They know belief can falter. That's why they overcorrect so violently. Not out of cruelty, but fear. Because if one world forgets how to believe, what's stopping the next? There's a haunting fan theory I've come across, that the Golden Throne itself doesn't just sustain the Emperor, but feeds on collective belief. That the strength of his will, his psychic presence, is tethered not just to sacrifice or devotion, but to the raw subconscious belief of the masses. So every time a world's faith dies, a part of him dims. And maybe that's why the Ecclesiarchy burns so bright when doubt creeps in. Because it's not just doctrine at stake, it's survival. So yes, faith breaks, sometimes quietly, sometimes with screams, but it does break. And every time it does, the Ecclesiarchy scrambles to patch the rupture, to silence the memory, to pretend it never happened. But for those who saw it, who felt the collapse, it never really leaves them. And maybe, just maybe, they walk away not as heretics, but as survivors of something far more terrifying than doubt. Survivors of a system that couldn't quite hold. You said, Molodec prodowcui, Justina 12, Visnovok i Pitpiska, emocjina refleksija na temu, jak se навколо, виготовлена віра, чиє вона менш реальною, чи не є кожна форма віри маніпуляцією, заклик до глядача задуматися, що є вірою у нашому світі. Завершення і підписка. 5К символів. Не пиши під темі і не виділяй вечірній чи курсив. Пам'ятай, стиль твого переказу має бути гуманізованим, тобто не сухі факти, а ніби авторська розповідь фаната. Щоб були якісь емоції, оцінки, аналіз, ставлення до цього ідей. Розказуй теорії та думки інших фанатів про це питання. Не пиши римські цифри, а пиши словами. Ангели, якщо будуть цифри, то прописуй їх словами. Не пиши далі в кінці. ChatGPT said, "So after all of this, after the statues that bleed oil, the sermons shouted by machines, the children raised on hymns of fire and ash, you have to ask the question, if faith is manufactured, does that make it less real?" It's something I've wrestled with for a long time. On the one hand, it feels like a betrayal. Faith, in its purest form, should be something that comes from within, something personal, something free. But in the Imperium, that freedom is an illusion. Everything is engineered. The architecture, the rituals, the stories. They're all meticulously crafted to steer the human soul toward one conclusion: worship the Emperor or vanish into silence. It's a system, an enormous galaxy-spanning mechanism, and you're just one gear in its design. But here's the part that really messes with your head. Even knowing that, even seeing how calculated and manipulative it all is, people still believe. And sometimes, that belief is beautiful. You'll see a mother weep as she lights a candle for a child she lost in a hive collapse. You'll see a dying soldier whisper a prayer with his last breath, not because anyone forced him to, but because he wants to believe that something beyond death is watching, that his sacrifice meant something. And that's when you realize that belief, no matter how it's planted, has a life of its own. You can seed it through lies, nurture it with fear, but when it blooms, it's still real. And maybe that's the scariest part. The machine works because, on some level, we want it to. We need it. The galaxy is too cruel, too chaotic, too vast. If no one's in control, then what's the point? So we cling to the manufactured comfort, the constructed hope, because it's better than the alternative. A lot of fans talk about the Emperor as a god of contradictions, dead but alive, divine but silent, savior but tyrant. But maybe the real contradiction is us. We hate the manipulation, we resent the control, but we also need the shape it gives to the void. Without it, we're just dust and instinct. With it, we become something directed, chosen, sacred, even if that sanctity is built on a lie. And look, I'm not saying that makes the system okay. It doesn't. The torture, the fear, the mind wipes, that's not faith. That's tyranny. But inside that tyranny, people still find meaning. They make it real by living it, by dying for it, by carrying it into places even the Ecclesiarchy never reaches. In a twisted way, maybe that's the most powerful testament to human will, that even in the most brutal, manipulative environment imaginable, we still create something sacred. So what does that mean for us? What does it say about belief in our own world, about the stories we've been told since childhood, the rituals we repeat, the symbols we never question? How much of our faith is ours, and how much has been handed to us, wrapped in flags, holidays, and traditions? And if we unwrap it, if we dig down to the core, what do we actually find there? I don't have the answer. I'm not here to preach or to convert. But if you've made it this far, maybe you're asking those questions too. Maybe you've started looking around and wondering what parts of your life were chosen and what parts were crafted. And if that thought scares you, good. It should. Because faith in any universe is dangerous. It builds empires, it justifies horrors, but it also gives us light in the dark. So next time you see someone bowing their head, lighting a candle, or whispering to the stars, maybe ask yourself, does it matter how they got there? Or is the fact that they need to believe already enough to make it real? And if this left you thinking, if even a part of you paused to question how belief shapes your world, then I hope you'll stick around. There's more to uncover, more to unlearn, and more to wonder about. Hit that subscribe button, share your thoughts in the comments, and let me know what you think makes faith real. Because in a galaxy built on lies, maybe truth starts with the questions we dare to ask.